Loretta, thank you so much again for joining us. I am so excited to have both the counselor slash mom view on this so that it's in addition to my view as educator, school leader, mom, etc. Tell us a little bit about your background because we, of course, are going to understand that to be where all of your learning that you're going to share with us comes from today.
Okay, so I am a middle school counselor. I have been a middle school counselor for 16 years. And I was not a teacher before that. I was able to stay home with my children when they were younger. And then as they got older and went back to school, I decided I really wanted to do something in the school realm. And so sometimes for me, that not having been a teacher piece gives me a little bit of a different perspective
Sure.
on things. I think also because I have really stayed consistently in middle school, I've seen kind of evolution and change of things from when I started in 2004 up until now.
Absolutely. So what I love about you being middle school also, because obviously there's a elementary scope here, there's a high school scope here, but what I know about your experience in middle school is that you get parts of that because you help transition kids and parents from elementary school, and likewise you turn around and then help transition them to high school. So you have a good sense of when we think about this idea of parenting with your kids' education in mind, you have a good sense kind of across that spectrum.
Yes, we see where they're coming from and know what they're going to.
Yeah, absolutely. That's key. So we're going to hop right in, folks. We're going to start by talking about some of the common terms we hear around parenting in schools. And of course, from the introduction, you know that we're really focusing on how to find balance, right? How to not be one of those parents, right, who's gone way too far. And we'll talk about that. But yet be the supportive parent and not be an absent parent. So I'm going to go into a couple of them real quickly, and then Loretta's going to share a couple, and then from there we're going to talk about how you figure your kind of spot or place in all of that. So one common parent or terminology we've heard for a long time now is the notion of a helicopter parent. And that's a parent who takes a really hyper overprotective or excessive interest in the life of their kids. And I actually went and looked up some articles. I have an understanding of that, but I wanted to give folks a reference. So I'll put those in the podcast notes. So helicopter parents typically hover and micromanage primarily, interestingly enough, out of fear, right? They observe every morsel of their kids' life, right? From everything to what they eat to what they're doing, who they're interacting with. They keep a really close eye on every piece of homework they touch, etc. And they hold their kids really close to them. But honestly, from a research perspective, it's almost always because they're really just anxious about the big world that they're going into. And they're doing everything they can do to make sure that that works out perfectly, if you will. And of course, I think this is going to be true of all of these parent models, if you will, that we talk about. Most people don't realize that's them, right? So it's, we might talk about those parents, and it's hard to recognize when you're one of those parents. The second one would be snowplow parent. So this is a little bit different because this parent is constantly forcing obstacles out of their kids' paths, right? They have an eye on their kids' future success, where they know they want them to go, the path they want them to follow, and they're going to make sure nobody or nothing gets in their way, right? They're going to make sure the path is clear. These parents might also, kind of like helicopter parents, micromanage like their diets and their homework and all that stuff. But they're doing it not necessarily out of the fear that the helicopter parent is, but more out of, again, eye on the prize. I see where we're going, and I'm going to make sure we get there. These are the parents who are, sitting in the principal's office because they want extra courses for their special kid or other special allowances for their special kid. And lots of times what we kind of get a sense of with the snowplow parent especially is that they have a little bit of an entitlement complex, right? Like their kids entitled to all these things that they believe they should have in order to get to that prize. So what a couple of others, Loretta, what else would you throw into that?
So from the middle school perspective, I tend to put sometimes parents in two different categories. One I call new parents, right? So those are the parents who are new to middle school. They've loved being in elementary school. They loved everything about it and how they could be super involved with their kids and in their classrooms and see what's going on and kind of be able to touch every piece of it. And the whole entire idea of middle school completely freaks them out.
Yeah.
These are the type of parents who, when we have sixth grade orientation and it is a student-only activity, I will have to physically put my body in front of them and say, I'm sorry, ma'am, but it's only students from this point forward. Well,
Yeah.
can I just go look in the room? No, this is for students. I promise we'll take very good care of them. And in an hour and a half, you can pick them up right outside the building. But they are just, everything is new to them,
Yeah.
and they are unable to allow their child to experience it without them experiencing it at the same time.
And there's fear there too, isn't there? Like they really are terrified of what's going to happen if I turn them over to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if they're not a new parent, then they're kind of almost the opposite end of the spectrum for me, which is what I call the repeat parent, which is I've already had a kid go through middle school. I know exactly what they're going to take. That one took Algebra 1. This one will take Algebra 1. They can handle it. It's not a big deal. And so for me, the issue with that is a lot of times it's hard to tell a parent, well, your kids are very different.
Yeah.
And although we parent the same, or we think we parent kids all the same, their interests and their desires and their sometimes their ability can be different.
Yeah.
And so a kid is struggling because their parent is just looking at them going, well, your older sibling was able to do it, you should be able to do it.
Sure. No, that's such a great point. So I'm glad you added that one in there. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but that also kind of circles back to this idea of sometimes we disappear on the second kid, right? Like we're overly involved with the first one, and then we feel so comfortable that we kind of disappear on the next one. So we'll come to that as well. I think that an example that comes to my mind of that has a little bit of all of those in it is being in and I'm trying to remember what the context was. It was a parent like group meeting, and we were talking about grading, and I know exactly what it was. It's when the district there actually was starting at the elementary level to think about standard-based grading. And so it was a committee, and it had parents and teachers and counselors and everybody in it. And I remember the mom of a kindergartner. So she was I'm going to call her new parent from your category. And she really wanted to know how teachers were going to consult with parents about when their kids got an S. And an S at that time was like a satisfactory on something, right? If it wasn't the top thing, as if the teacher should consult with the parent to determine the grade, right? So that's an example of kind of falling into that. Now, with that in mind, my guess is a lot of folks listening to us are going to be wondering, they're going to be self-checking, right? They're going to be like, because Loretta and I in our pre-podcast chat talked about how so often parents think about these kinds of categories, if you will, and they envision other people, right? They think of those parents, not of themselves. We don't often self-assess ourselves to kind of check where we are. So we kind of came up with a few questions that might be good checks for you if you're thinking about, all right, wait a minute, do I fall in that realm? Because I don't think I do. I don't think most parents think they do. So here are some questions, and I'll put these in the podcast notes that you might consider. Do you email your child's teachers weekly or even more often than that about questions that your kid should be able to answer? Note that distinction, right? These are questions that your kid who sits in the school all day, no matter what age they are. Now, you could argue, yes, younger elementary, there's going to be a little bit of flex there, but it's certainly as they're getting older elementary and middle school. Are you emailing about things they should be able to answer? Are you checking your child's grades on an assignment before he or she even has a chance to, right? They turned it in, they haven't even gotten home yet, and you're on the electronics system trying to see what the grade is, right? Anticipating that the teacher has already graded. Do you contact your child's teachers about grades versus empowering your kid to have that conversation themselves, right? Are you the person who reaches out versus encouraging your child and helping your child figure out how to have those conversations? If your child gets in trouble at school, especially low-level stuff like they were tardy or they didn't turn in a homework or whatever it is, are you quick to defend them, right? Are you essentially from the get-go saying, the school must have really gotten this wrong and we're going to go fix this for you, right? Again, are you jumping into the fight, so to speak? And then lastly, and Loretta, I'll ask if you have any to add to this. Do you assume that your kid should, well, of course, they're always going to win, right? Whatever it is, the contest, the race, the spelling bee, the whatever. And the moment they don't, you're at the school because you need to defend how there needs to be a revote, so to speak, right? Because your kid, of course, should be the one winning. Those are some things I can think of. Can you think of anything to add to that, Loretta?
I would just also say that if, as a parent, the assignment, the rubric, and everything about it better than your child
Mm,
does, then you also need to kind of stop and know what you're doing,
yeah.
because we still have a fair amount of parents who are completing assignments and turning them in for students. And
Yeah, yeah, this is true at all levels, right? At all
yes,
levels,
yeah,
elementary, middle, and high. And that's, we could spend a whole hour just talking about that, folks. But let's just say if you're doing that, that too would put you in this criteria list of maybe you're going too far. So those are definitely some things to consider. And that part of the conversation, actually, Loretta, probably ties into our later part about kind of overscheduling your kids and listening to them, right? So we're gonna, let's talk about some obvious cons, right? Like some ramifications long term that could come from being this parent with your kid's education. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few, and again, Loretta, I'll have you jump in and add to those. So when parents meet these definitions, what we find when we dig into some of the research and read some of the studies behind it is that typically kids in that situation are going to be less resilient. They're going to be less likely to take risk. They're going to be less likely to develop really sophisticated coping skills and even just kind of typical coping skills. And certainly, they're going to be less inclined to make decisions on their own. That's going to be the kid who freezes when there's a decision to be made and their parent's not around because they're not used to being the one who makes the decisions. And I'll stretch that too to say that those kids of those parents are probably more likely to see school as the enemy, right? When we talk about school at home, it's from a defensive standpoint. It's from a us against them standpoint. So that's a caution, of course, because kids spend a long time at school, and certainly we want kids to be thinking about school as the place where they're going to be partnering, right? The school partners with their parents to help them develop into independent young adults. So those are some things to think about. Likewise, I would add, you see a lack of confidence in these kids, right? Again, that whole tying into the whole, I must not be able to solve problems myself because my parent always does it, which must mean they think I can't. And certainly that can carry over, right? Now you've got kids who are really, really dependent on parents. And we see that carry over, not just from elementary to middle and middle to high, but those are the college freshmen who are really sitting there in dorms away from home for the first time, frozen, right? Because now they're in an environment where the parent's voice doesn't weigh as much. So those are some of the things. And Loretta, I know you see probably examples of that all the time in your day-to-day work.
absolutely. I think these kids are really trying to develop who they are and try and start to see. They're not in elementary anymore. They're getting ready, right, for that high school and for all of that. So their grades are not as important because they're not getting high school credit for a lot of these classes. They don't go on their transcripts. But when kids in middle school are worried that if they get a C, that someone, they won't be able to go to the college of their dream because
Yeah.
someone is going to see it, then we're creating a scenario where we're putting too much emphasis on that for these kids, and scenarios where parents are like berating teachers to find out, well, why didn't my kid get an A? Well, what were they missing? We followed the rubric, and that starts to lead you down that road of, well, who's we?
Yeah.
Is this really what a student's doing? And is it really that important? And who's really the most upset that the student is not on the all A honor roll? Is it the student, or is it the parent because they're not invited to go to that ceremony and see the other parents and go and talk with the people at the bus stop about the fact that their kid is on the all A honor roll and things like that. And there is no relationship between students that have a little bump in the road who get into trouble for something like being tardy to class or have to have a lunch detention, and the fact that they're not very good students. Parents
Right.
seem to want to say that, if my kid is getting all A's, then they're perfect all the way around. And we need to recognize that this is the time where they need to have those little hiccups and those bumps so that they can then learn from it. At some point they are going to get a grade that's not going to be exactly what they were hoping for, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But as parents, if we're not giving them that opportunity to learn, struggle, learn, and then move forward, we're creating a world where they're not going to be able to really reach their potential.
Sure. And I love that you've kind of thrown a wide net there, that moves us into, okay, so how do I shift, right? Like if I take the little quiz we just offered and I realize I answered yes to like all five or four or three or two or even just one of those questions, right? And I'm thinking about, okay, so if I believe that maybe that's not the best thing for my kid, how to shift, you're starting to really help us with that part of the conversation, because a big part of the conversation is be willing to accept that it's okay for your kid to fail. And please send them the message that it's okay for them to fail. And don't get me wrong, obviously we're focusing on parents right now, and there's a lot of pieces that we're going to talk about that we could dig into. And as always, I hope that anybody listening, if there's a particular piece you want to make sure we dig into, please, respond on the Facebook page and prompt us in that direction. And I want to be careful about not sounding one-sided, right? There's an educator side to this. So when we talk about grades, for example, Loretta, I know for some parents that would pique their kind of like, well, the grading's not fair and the grading's biased and the grading's, and those are all things that are potentially true and that we work on all the time in schools, right? All the time. So I'm not negating those potentials, but what we're saying is even with that, it's important to allow your kid the chance to experience failure. And we really work hard with teachers with that as well. And it's hard for teachers, don't get me wrong, right? There's a reason that teachers offer extra credit and do things that are safety nets, if you will, for kids that don't involve the kid actually showing they've mastered material, but it's more to kind of partner with them on getting that A, even if that A doesn't necessarily reflect what they've learned, right? So allowing your kid space to fail. So Loretta, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that. Like, what does that look like in school? What are a couple of examples of ways that parents can kind of back off, if you will, a little bit and let that happen? And talk about the whole notion of like the worst thing that could happen, right? Like, let's talk about that piece too.
So, one of the fantastic things about middle school is that for us anyway, students have the ability or the opportunity to take high school level classes in areas like math or world language. But they have this, beautiful get out of jail free card, which is that any student that takes a high school credit class at the middle school level is able to expunge that grade at the end of the year. So if you decide that as a seventh grader, you want to take Spanish 1 and it doesn't go very well, because as much as we tell them that it's a high school class, they're young, they're 12 years old, and a lot of times they're just not ready for the commitment. But they can, at the end of the year, they can expunge that grade and it disappears.
Yeah.
So, they're able to have that opportunity of, having the experience, but then not having to have the consequence of having the grade.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, there are a lot of parents who will say, but they have to sit in there and then they feel bad because they're not doing well. And I can understand that to a certain extent. And there are some students that might have to struggle with that point. But for a lot of students, what you're gaining is the exposure to all of the material.
Absolutely.
And if you're learning vocabulary along the way, you're going to learn, if you're putting that effort into it, you can go ahead and get that vocabulary. And there are things that will help you and be a benefit to. And some would even say that for if they're taking math courses, we don't move them out. You stay in that math course. And, you might have to say that for parents and students, we're not going to look at that grade.
Right.
We're not going to consider that when we're saying, when we look at your report card. We don't even hand out report cards anymore. Yeah. Everything is online. So really, everything about your grades can be so private that I think it's much, much easier for parents not to have that fear and worry of how other students can know.
Yeah.
Students are very open and they will tell each other.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it's parents that are more upset by that than students.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that one. And I'll caution, because the policy around taking high school credit classes that Loretta is describing is unique to the district she works in, and might not be unique. There might be other districts, but it's not everywhere, right? So that might not be true of your kid's middle school. It's going to be important for you to ask those questions and have that conversation with your counselors around the balance of, okay, they want to take this, they want to make this stretch and try this out, but what happens if they're not successful? So, and I would wager that in any middle school, even if they don't have the really important safety net of, okay, well, it was a high school credit class, you can expunge it and you can just try again and no harm, no foul, that at the very least they can describe pretty elaborate system of supports to ensure your kid has every shot to experience success. And if they can't do that, then that's a talking point for you. That's a really important talking point for you with your school. So in general, allowing your kids to fail. Now, some smaller examples we chatted about, and this is going to sound kind of silly to some people, but it's true. It's the examples of ways to let your student experience failure that allows them to learn and grow, and to frankly learn the lesson that it's okay to fail. The world is not going to end, right? And we have to be the people sending the message. The world is not going to end, I promise, right? If we're the people sending the opposite message, that's going to contribute to a whole different conversation about anxiety in kids and things that lead to, depression and those kinds of things. But in this instance, so one example I'll offer is not being the parent who drops everything to bring their kid's forgotten item to school, right? Your kid texts you and says, I forgot my math homework. Not dropping everything, and frankly, not dropping anything. If you just happen to be at home and you have nothing better going on, still resisting the urge to save them by running it to school, and instead talking about that beforehand. And this is going to lend itself in a few minutes to our conversation about how we're just structuring boundaries for kids. But beforehand, letting your kid know, look, if you forget something, it's going to be unfortunate, and it's going to be awkward for you to have to say, I don't have it, and even frankly, to have your lunch. But you'll be able to figure out a solution, right? If it's the homework, you're going to talk to your teacher. And if you take a 0 for that homework, you're going to take a 0 for that homework, right? Part of completing the homework successfully is actually getting it delivered to the source it's supposed to be delivered in. If it's forgetting the lunch money, then, you're going to be the kid asking your friend to share some of his or share some of hers or whatever it is. Or maybe the school has a way to get you a free lunch if you don't have money. And now, of course, that's almost an outdated thing because all the money goes electronically, but the point is still the same, right? So in other words, allow your kid a chance to see that you're not going to save them, that in those moments when they falter, because they're going to falter their entire lives, that they just have to kind of consider the context they're in and figure out the best solution in that case. What are you thinking?
Yeah, well, a couple of things come to mind. One is we seem to have a kind of an increase in this over the past several years is students at school, and we get to class and there's a substitute. And I don't want to be in class with a substitute, so I text my mom and say, come and pick me up.
Wow.
And we get parents who show up at school and will come into our main office and say, oh, my kid texted me, they don't like the substitute, so I should come and pick them up.
Oh, wow.
Same thing will happen for, I have a history test last block and I really didn't study for it. I forgot. So can you come and pick me up so I don't have to take the test?
Yeah.
And that also happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, it's just beyond me sometimes that when we actually sit down and think that all the way through, how that is one of those things that makes sense to people.
So based on your experience, Loretta, what do you think is the impetus for a parent to, in those examples, why do you think the parent comes to pick them up to save them from the history tester? And then likewise, what would you recommend instead, right? How they talk to their kid instead about that?
We had talked earlier about the idea that sometimes in the middle, I can only speak for what happens at the middle school, but yeah. I think they want their child to like them or to be their friend or to kind of see them as someone that backs them up 100%.
Yeah.
And so they don't want, they would get mad at me if I didn't do that, or they would, they wouldn't like it if I told them that I couldn't come and get them.
Right.
And so sometimes when you find out those situations, because sometimes you just honestly have to say, did you really come and pick them up?
Right.
And say, well, they texted me and said they needed me to. And I think part of that comes from that idea as they become middle schoolers and they are kind of moving away and don't need us in the same way that they did when they were little. We kind of see that as parents as that opportunity to do something to help them and to have that, moment where they have that connection.
Yeah.
But in the long term, it's really not something that's helpful.
Sure, absolutely. Because again, what you've done is allowed them to escape the consequence, right? So, and I think you're 100% right that sometimes, and of course we're going to try not to speak in generalities, folks, but that sometimes it is about this is a chance for me to connect. This is for a chance for us to have a positive, because the older they get, the more negative you have, right, with them, the more combative the relationship is. That's all a natural progression of the parenting relationship. I used to tell parents all the time at around 13, 14, they start to hate you and you're an idiot, but they come back around 18, 19, and they don't hate you anymore and you're not stupid any longer, right? So it's just, you just have to, it gets better. You just have to make your way through it. But so I think it's that, but I also think it's, and again, and we can maybe kind of flex this conversation and touch on this and come back to it, is this piece about, what our kids do outside of school, right? And we talk about that in episode 5. So we've talked a little bit about this, but in this context, the impact of when your kid is overscheduled outside of school. So if I'm the parent who insists that my kid is involved in 27 activities. And yes, for some of us, we think it's because they want to, but there's a reflection piece here, right, to go back to figure out how much of this is your kid wants to and loves it, how much of it is you feel like they're supposed to because that's the way they're going to be competitive, etc. But if I'm the parent whose kid said, I didn't study for history, can you please pick me up, right? Assuming it's that nice. It's not always in middle school and high school. If I'm that parent, and I'm also the parent who took him from basketball practice yesterday to piano lessons, both of which he doesn't really love, and it's a battle to get him to every time, I might just feel guilty, right? Like, I created this mess yesterday because he was gone all night and didn't have time to do homework. So yeah, I'm going to save him from having to take the test today.
Well, and for me, that goes to this point that we really try and talk to students about school is your job.
Yeah.
Right now, school is your job. And so you have to act professionally. You have to dress professionally in a sense of, you at least have to adhere to dress code, but you have to take it seriously. And what you put into it is what you're going to get out of it. And so along those same lines, the parent who says, I'm going to pull my kid out of school because we're going to go on XYZ vacation, and we're going to be gone, and we're going to go ahead and let those teachers know that we're going to be gone for, 7 to 10 days. But then the expectation sometimes is not that the student and or the parent is responsible for how that work gets made up.
Absolutely.
What classes are going on when you're not there?
Yeah.
And is it really fair to kind of put that burden on a teacher to say that they're going to reteach you all of the information that you missed?
Right.
And so, we're always going to live in a society where the parents are going to decide what's best for their kids, and that's absolutely their right to do so. But when you do something like that, it's the parent who says either they're going to take on the responsibility to teach their kids what they missed, or they're going to hire a tutor or something where they're taking care of that. And is it worth it for your kid? You see these kids, the parents are dragging them in here, 45 minutes before school starts every morning and making them stay after every day to make up for, a 5-day vacation. And they're so exhausted, and then their grades suffer, and then some kids just can't recover from missing like that.
Yeah. No, that's a really great point. Again, it's another angle to think about, right? It really comes down to how we're making decisions with our kids. And again, and I appreciate that you pointed this out, like, okay, take a vacation, and in some cases, people have to go. Somebody died, right? So we have to be gone or what have you. But I love the idea of empowering both the parent and the kid to think about, okay, I have a job if I work outside the home, and you have a job. Your job is school. We have to be gone for a period of time. How are we going to both kind of catch up at work, right? This is what we're going to do ahead of time to make sure we get caught up. This is what we're going to do while we're gone to be sure we're caught up. This is what we do after. Versus making, again, saving your kid, kind of being the snowplow parent who removes all obstacles by going in and saying, we're going to be gone, and now I'm going to need you all here at school to do A, B, C, and D, right? So I like the idea of, again, kind of using it as an opportunity with the parent to model problem solving, and we're going to do it together, right? What are your ideas, kid? What are my ideas? And then let's, make a request and see what happens with it. So again, tying it kind of to the bigger idea of how are we spending our time with our kids, right? So when you have chronic issues, and we're not going to get into a lot of chronic issues in this conversation, but when you have, we're talking about not saving your kid when they don't bring their homework once in a while, or not saving them, solving all the problems. And then we have kids who chronically have that problem, right? Like, and you have kids in other realms who have special needs that are, that these kinds of things happen with and they're exacerbated. So we're not necessarily talking about those kinds of situations. We're really talking more generally speaking. And again, then from a parent perspective, how we jump in. Interestingly enough, I feel like it's not unusual. And Loretta, I want you to weigh in on this. It's not unusual, right, for us to be thinking about parenting based on what we're seeing at school, and we're wondering, okay, if this keeps happening, or if this parent keeps showing up, or teachers are getting an email every day from this parent, like, what's happening at home? Of course, that's a natural wondering on our part, just like parents wonder at school, right? Like, if my kid hates math, what's happening in the classroom, right? I mean, it's both ways, makes a lot of sense. And sometimes what we get is the parent who comes in and just says, I don't know what to do, right? This thing is happening outside of school. How do I deal with it, right? Which technically you could argue, not our purview, it's outside of school, but we don't, right? Instead, we use that as an opportunity to say, well, let's talk about the big picture. Let's understand how you're parenting at home, right? Because as much as we want as adults to think that we have the control, right? There comes a certain age where maybe they don't have control. The kids don't have control, but they certainly can make your life miserable, right? And so how do we, help parents kind of figure out how to strike the balance, right? And go with that. So again, from your perspective, how do you see that happening with parents kind of looking to you for guidance? And then what do you see happening lots of times that might be lending themselves at home, that lends itself to some of the stuff we have, happen in schools?
I think kind of what happens at the middle school level sometimes is that, there are parents who kind of look at elementary school as they have to do a lot of hand holding and they're right there with them.
Yep.
And then they get to middle school and they're kind of like, okay, free, you're done. They'll look at their kid when they pick them up from practice or school or whatever and say, did you get your homework done? And they say yes. And that's the end of the conversation. Yep. There's no kind of guidance. There's no, well, let me see it. Well, let me show me what it is that you did. A lot of us have online platforms where there's a lot of places that students can, the information is stored. So It's not, I left it in my locker.
Right.
That's not a scenario we have to worry about anymore. So it's that idea of saying to parents, this is not something you should be doing alone, and it's not something they should be doing alone.
Yeah.
It's that idea of, every night we have a set time where you do homework. No matter what, you are doing homework for 30 or 45 minutes. Yeah. And that's the expectation. That students need to know that no matter what they're doing throughout their day, 95 different activities, and all of them are important, but so is school. Right. And so, there is that piece of, if you don't help them to develop the study habits and the organization, which can be a nightmare, I get it, but if you don't put stuff into it, very, very few of them are born very neat and orderly and organized. Right. They eventually get there. But it is that idea of, there needs to be clear and set expectations for them. They need to be outlined. You write them down, you stick them on the refrigerator, and we say, this is it. And we all live by those rules, adults and children in the house. And I think that can at least put some order into some chaos and avoid. There's a lot of middle school parents who talk about having, like, my kid had a tantrum, and they're not babies anymore. Right. But there's a lot of stress sometimes to things that are unknown and when they can't define what it is that they want them to do. Yeah. The example you and I had talked about the other day was the idea of, when you walk into your child's bedroom and you say, this room is a mess, you need to clean it up, and you walk out, does your child know what that means? Right? Because cleaning their room to you and cleaning their room to them can be very different. Yeah. So, that is an example that I use with parents, and I say to them, you need to define 1, 2, and 3, your top 3 of what you want that to look like. I say school needs to be, and school work and your involvement in school and that kind of stuff needs to be very similar. Sure.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I love the analogy to clean your room. And I back that up with, or I add to that by saying, and write it down, right? You're constantly texting your kids, so don't just say it's 1, 2, 3, and 4, because from a brain development perspective, by the way, you're also dealing with beings who don't have fully developed brains. So your best outcome option is, here are the 4 things that I'm going to be looking for when I come back to check this, so that with our 12-year-old, and it's funny because I know all this and I still fall into the trap, right? Because I feel like we've done it 100 times, but we needed to do it 101 times, right? So it's okay. So it's Saturday morning. I want you to go ahead and tidy up in here. We've done this. We've walked through it. We've done the steps. We've done the whole thing. And I still come back in an hour, and lo and behold, maybe like 1 thing has been moved, right? And then I'm reminded, okay, here we go. Let me just text this to you. Okay, great. Now let me take every other device that you have away from you. Not away as in a punishment, but let's just get the distraction out of the way and let you follow through with it. So, and like you said, that example, that analogy carries over to school, right? These are the expectations that we have. These are the parameters we're going to agree to. And I love your emphasis on, and then we're all going to do it, right? So if it's a home thing, like no devices at the dinner table, that means none of us, right? If it's a school thing, like we're going to, 2 to 3 times a week, sit together, look at the online system and go over homework and assignments and missing and all that, then we actually follow through as adults. And that is so easy to say and so hard to do, right?
Yes.
Yeah. The other thing that as you were talking, so I feel like we're kind of bouncing around with some ideas, and so I want to capture a couple of them. We've talked about letting your kid fail, right? It's okay if they forget something. It's okay if they take that test they didn't feel like they studied for, and really sending the message to them. And I'm going to say, folks, even at the high school level, right? It's not going to be the end of the world. So I don't want to emphasize that, elementary and middle, it's okay if their grades are, even at the high school level, I would like us to consider that sending any message that any decision they make in high school is going to be the end of the world for them is probably contributing to a bigger issue where we send kids to the dark side, right? Because whether they come out of high school ready for a 4-year college or a 2-year college or a tech school or whatever it is, they can change that path at any time. And so that F they got in physics in 10th grade won't matter in 5 years. It won't matter in 10 years. Let's not pretend it's going to be the end of the world, right? Let them experience the failure if that's what they have to do, because the way they learn not to forget stuff, the way they learn to spend more time studying, etc., is to face the consequences of when it didn't go so well that last time. Yeah.
It has to mean something to them, not just you.
Yeah, I love that. Has to mean something to them, not just you. So a part of, another piece of it then, the third piece I wanted to make sure we definitely got to is kind of, it all goes hand in hand, but empowering them to problem solve for themselves, right? We talked about that a little bit in the not saving them by bringing stuff to them. So that involves some problem solving. But I'm thinking about an example, because we've been talking about a lot of things that have to do with academics, and there's so much more, right? And frankly, the more overwhelms them just as much as the academics. So I'm thinking about when 2 of our kids were in elementary school and came home one afternoon, so younger elementary, like maybe 2nd and 4th grade, came home one afternoon really upset because another little girl on the bus was being bullied, and she was a girl who didn't speak English well, and there were other kids picking on her for it, etc. Now, at the time, I was I think it was a middle school principal. So it would have been easy for me to pick up the phone, call my colleague at their elementary school who was their principal and say, hey, Deb, here's what's happening. Can you check into it, right? And of course, as a parent, I was just so happy that they came home upset about it, right? That they saw it, they knew it was wrong, and they were upset about it. But instead, I kind of simply said, so what do you think is wrong with that? And I let them talk through that. And then, so what do you think should happen instead? Well, somebody should talk to them. Somebody's going to have to talk to them to keep them from doing that. They need to be told that it's wrong. Okay, who should that be? Somebody at school. Great. Who should that be, right? So walking them through the thinking process, you pointed out the fact that you can't just say clean your room and they're going to know exactly what you mean, right? So I can't just say, well, maybe you should talk to somebody, right? Walking them through the process until we got to the point where they said, we're going to go talk to Miss So-and-so, who was their elementary school principal, tomorrow, and tell her what's wrong and tell her why we're upset and ask her to help. Great. And guess what? That's exactly what they did. And they came home the next day and she had done exactly what I hoped she would do, right? Because as a parent, you have to trust, please talk to them. Please take them seriously. Please, right? So complete the cycle here. And then eventually they saw the trickle down behavior of the kids on the bus leaving her alone, right? So they saw that they could use their voices to solve the problem. and that action would happen as a result of that. That it wasn't the message that stuff only happens if adults talk to each other, right? That they understood that they had some power there. So I think that's another big one, right? Empowering your kids to see themselves as problem solvers. What do you think about that?
Well, I think one of the things that I will say that I find a lot of middle schoolers are that way.
Yeah.
I think we have spent a lot of time talking with kids about the idea of what's a bully, what's a victim, what's a bystander,
Yep.
what's an upstander.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And who are trusted adults and where do you find them?
Yeah.
And we continually ask students to be able to tell us, do you know the definitions of these words? Do you know who these people are? Can
Yeah.
you identify, a trusted adult in this building that you would go to if you had a problem?
That's huge.
And we sometimes get a lot of our business, as I like to say. I don't necessarily have a now serving number
Right.
out my door, but when 3 girls start walking up to your office, usually what you're going to get, and that is people who are saying, we're worried about our friend.
Yeah.
We're upset about something that happened. I think that students, and this is an area where I would say social media sometimes can be a positive,
Mm-hmm.
and the shows that they have seen on television, where I do think that they see people that they relate to and that they look up to as, on their own level.
Sure.
People that are doing those things.
Yeah.
And so they have examples and they're seeing that. Unfortunately, what I would say in the same breath is that sometimes they're seeing their parents not necessarily do that.
Yeah.
Because we have some of these, Real Housewives pages where people will post about teachers or say things, and they don't necessarily understand that, what they're doing is the stuff that we talk to their kids about not doing.
Yeah.
So I do think that when it comes to being concerned about a friend or seeing a student that might be mistreated or being treated poorly by other people, that we do have a lot of kids who are quick to kind of stand up and recognize that that is not right and want to do something to help. So I see that as a positive.
That's huge. I think I'm really glad you pointed out that positive because, one of the things as educators we have to constantly remind ourselves of is that we have, supported thousands of kids and thousands of parents. but for every parent, this is like their first or their second or maybe their third or fourth if they have a larger family. And so it's easy to get caught up in some of the misconceptions out there that, as to use your example of social media, that it's ruining them completely. But what you're saying is, obviously there are pros and cons. There's a lot to be concerned about with social media. That's a different episode. But that some of the positives are they do see the models, right? They see people they look up to on social media who then turn and they couple that with all the messaging you're giving them at school, how to be what's a bystander, what's a bully, what's a upstander, like you said. And they can put that together and say, wait, I want to be that, right? I want to do what that person does. So then I can come to people like you or my teacher or my parent and say, okay, I saw this happen. I want to be that. What do we do, right? How do we walk through that? Yeah, I think that's also very significant. So we talked about, letting them fail and sending the message that it's okay to fail because you're going to learn from it and we're going to be there to help pick you up and then we're going to move forward and you're going to go forward and succeed. We've talked about helping them learn how to solve problems themselves, right? Versus you feeling like you have to jump in and solve everything for them. And we've talked a little bit about this idea of reflecting as a parent on what's the situation at home, right? What have we set up at home? What are the expectations we've agreed to? What are the boundaries we've agreed to? We talked about this last week in the episode, and we'll talk a little bit, but to reinforce it here, the idea that once you set up those rules, you can't change them because you start to panic, right? That when it's time to change them, then you have the next conversation, right? You don't react to something, bad, quote unquote, that your kid did by suddenly changing the rules without talking through the why behind it. Yeah. Okay. The other piece that I wanted to make sure we touched on, and you introduced it, but I want us to kind of be very specific about it and then wrap up. So you're going to be thinking about your final word, right? What's the last thing you want people to hear you say about this topic, Loretta? But the last thing I want everybody to consider is this idea of not disappearing as they get older in school, right? So as much as this podcast is about checking ourselves and making sure we're not overly like overdoing it, I want to make sure the last piece that we really spend a little bit of time on is not to disappear either. And Loretta talked about it in terms of, she gave the example of homework, right? Like in elementary school, lots of times we're like sitting right beside our kid, while they're doing the homework, and then they go to sixth grade and it's like, hey, are you done with your homework? Yeah, good, moving on, right? And we kind of remove ourselves. But we also do that physically, right? In elementary school, we're often really motivated, especially with our first or second kid. Again, it tends to dwindle and we need to remember not to do that, but we're motivated to be at the school, right? We're volunteering to be the classroom parent. We're volunteering on the PTA. Our kids love it when we show up and they hug us and their friends hug us and it's all wonderful. And then they get to like fifth and sixth grade and they look at you like they're gonna die, right? They might actually die if you show up at school, right? This is when they start to walk like 3 steps ahead of you or behind you or whatever, right? They're creating physical space. And so I want to say another kind of thing to consider in all of this is not disappearing, right? So my feeder middle school would hold an 8th grade promotion ceremony every year, and what I appreciated about it was that I had a chance to be the guest speaker every year. And so that was literally the one time probably that we had every kid, every parent or grandparents and everybody, right? They were all there in the room. And so I would use it as an opportunity to talk about how important it was, now that they were going to middle school or coming to high school at that point, to have boundaries and to have routines and to stick to them, right? And I would say this is the time when your kids are saying nobody else's parents make them put their phones away at night. Nobody else's parents, have to check with other parents when they're going to go hang out with their friends. Nobody else's ... right? Fill in the blank. And so I would always kind of jokingly say to the room, raise your hand if you're the parent who lets your kid do whatever they want whenever they want, right? And everybody would laugh because thank God nobody raised their hand. And there were people, I'm sure, they just weren't admitting it in that environment. But the message was, your kid's going to say nobody else's, but look around and agree and make eye contact with some people in the room. Yeah, there are, right? And we like to think the majority of people are doing that. So being present for your kid by doing that, but also show up at school. Now, you're not going to show up in school in the same ways, right? You're not going to go sit next to them in lunch and, hold their hand or whatever. But being there to support teachers, being there to support events, being there to support your PTA. Now you're moving from the kind of in front of the camera role as parent to behind the scenes, right? And be good with that. Be good with the fact that my kid doesn't have to see me here doing it for me to support my kid doing what they're doing, right? I can be back here making copies for in the teacher's workroom to support teachers, and that's just a way I'm supporting my kids' education without being in their face about it. Don't disappear. Know your kids' friends. Know the parents of your kids' friends, and we talk about that in episode 5, so I won't go into that here. But all of that ties into this idea of how to parent, right, with your kid with respect to their time in school.
Yep, absolutely. It's one of those things that I think sometimes we kind of don't know, or it seems unknown, or honestly, a lot of adults don't ever want to go back to middle school.
It's so true.
Experience.
Yep.
It takes a special breed of us to come here every day. I say that all the time, but there needs to be that support in a way that helps them to know that they are okay if things go wrong.
Yeah, I love that. And I would add to that, we started this conversation with some questions you could ask to check yourself, right? And I would add to that begin to create a culture among your adult friends, many of whom are parents of your kids' friends or teammates or what have you, right? Begin to build a culture among you to check yourselves on that, right? Are you creating a culture among you where we can talk about that out loud, where we can say to each other, gosh, did you really do that? Are you worried about this? Or maybe, is your kid going to learn anything if you do that? Or create a culture among you. And if you really don't know, if you're listening to this podcast and you're saying to yourself, but how do I find balance? Go talk to the folks at your kid's school, right? That makes Loretta happy because she wants 27 more people in line every Monday. But seriously, have the conversation. Like, oh, okay, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's what I think I'm doing. what are your suggestions, right? Am I, you can come right out and ask them, am I a helicopter parent? You can certainly do that. Give them the link to the podcast and let them know what you're talking about. But, or just simply say, look, I'm trying to find the balance of supporting my kid, but also helping them grow on their own. Help me with that, right? How do I approach that? All right, Loretta, final word for our folks who are out there listening.
So my final word is just that I would say, what happens is everything's going along great. Everybody's doing great. Everything's fine. And then, parents will say, like, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we hit some kind of a bump.
True.
And I don't know what happened. And now, I'm the worst parent in the world, and I've failed at parenting, and life is ruined, and everything's over. And I have many, many of times said to a parent, I just want you to know that you will be fine. You are not a bad parent. Your child will be fine. The reason that it's never happened before is because you've never hit the bump. Everybody at some point will hit the bump.
That's it.
And in all of my years, I've never had anybody do anything in middle school where they did not recover. As a matter of fact, at the end, they come out better and stronger. But anticipate that it's going to happen, and it should happen.
Yeah.
It's a natural part of life, and you will look back on it and laugh someday. I promise. Because if I had written everything down, I would have an awesome tight 10 right now, and I'd be doing stand up someplace, and it would be wonderful. But it will be okay, and you will be okay.
I love that. That's a great word to finish on. Loretta, you're awesome. Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate your insight. You'll probably be back. You don't know it yet, but I see all these things coming back because what I think every time we do something on a topic like this, we get questions about what about this though, and then it leads us to the next thing. So, I'm not going to say goodbye. I'm going to say until next time.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.